wanted to welcome everyone to our second installment of our Linden Beit Midrash program. We're honored to have Rabbi Michoel Zylberman here with us. I'm going to read his bio in a moment. It's actually the first time that I met Rabbi Zylberman in person, but we regularly communicate via email anytime any potential convert is looking for a conversion, any of that nature, maybe even in divorce or halachic prenups, things like that. I'm usually communicating with Rabbi Zylberman. So we're all connected to, many of us here in this shul are connected to Rabbi Zylberman in one way or another, even if you've never met him before. So now you have. Rabbi Zylberman's bio is as follows. Rabbi Michoel Zylberman serves on the REITs faculty, that's Yeshiva University, as a Rosh Chabura. Not, by the way, it says assistant bochein on the sheet. That was actually an error by the YU marketing department. So YU, if you're listening, this is the errors on your end, not my end. Anyhow, Rabbi Zylberman is a Rosh Chabura and is assistant to the director of the undergraduate Masmidim honors program at YU. He also functions as the assistant director, Gittin coordinator of the Beit Din of America, and Geras coordinator of the RCA and the Beit Din of America. Rabbi Zylberman studied for 2 years in Yeshiva University in Israel. David, is that where you know Rabbi Zylberman? There you go. So that's
high school.
Oh, even high school. Okay, before that. All right. Hopefully, you have some good stories about excellent. Okay, good. We'll talk later. Received his BA from YU and holds a Yora Yora and Yad and Yad Smicha from REITs. He was a member of the Wexner Kol Elyon and holds an MA from the Bernard Revel Graduate School in Medieval Jewish History. In addition to having published numerous articles, he is the author of Tov Lev on Masechas Pesachim, with appended Kuntras Das Yehudis on the laws of Gittin and Geras. We are honored to have Rabbi Zylberman with us. The topic for this evening's shir is titled Establishing Jewishness in the 21st Century, Challenges and Opportunities. Rabbi Zylberman.
Thank you, Rabbi Hess. It's an honor to be with you here this evening. It's an honor to have the opportunity to meet you in person for the first time. As you noted, we've communicated many times over the years, and hopefully we've done good things together, and hopefully that'll continue. But you're very fortunate to have such a wonderful rabbi as your leader here in this community. I imagine some of you probably knew Rabbi Dworkin. Unfortunately, I never had the privilege of meeting him in person, but his legacy very much still permeates the offices of the RCA where I work. And not only that, but in the classroom where I give shiurim in YU, the classroom is dedicated to the memory of Rabbi Dworkin. So I see his name just about every day in yeshiva when I come to give shiur. So his memory should be a blessing to all of you, and you have a tremendous chus of having Rabbi Hess with you currently. You'll forgive me if the source sheets seem a little bit robust. We're not going to read everything inside, so don't get scared by the template you have in front of you. One of the major jobs that we deal with at the Beis Din is personal status determinations. And the most prominent personal status determination that we're often asked to make is whether a person is Jewish, either in the context of getting married, in the context of making aliyah, of moving to Israel under the law of return, where a person may need to prove Jewishness. Often they will turn to a Beis Din and ask for a letter of certification, a determination that a person is Jewish. And we probably all know that there are usually two ways that a person could be Jewish. Either a person could be born to a Jewish mother, or a person could convert. Our focus this evening will be on the former. Conversion is another topic that I have much to say about, but we can't do everything in one evening. What I'd like to focus on is how we determine that someone is born to a Jewish mother, what is necessary from a strict Jewish law perspective in terms of evidence, when is self-representation acceptable, and when can public policy determination, perhaps going back centuries, create a different perspective or a different standard for making such determinations. And then we'll discuss some more contemporary issues that come up in recent decades or even in recent years that impact on this conversation. Just one caveat, when we say that in order for a person to be Jewish, they need to either be born from a Jewish mother or convert, there is a minority opinion among the authorities, position of Rashi in Kedushin, perhaps Tosfos, that even a person born to a Jewish mother, if the father is not Jewish, may require an act of conversion. Why that's so is a complicated matter that isn't so simple. It's not a position that we generally follow, but there is, you should just beware on the books, such a approach that even if a person has a Jewish mother but a non-Jewish father, some act of conversion may be required. Okay. The first source sheet that you have in front of you is the Rambam, Maimonides, the Laws of Isurei Bia, Forbidden Relationships, chapter 19, halacha 17. The Rambam here is quoting a Gemara in Kedushin Ayin Vav. This is quoted also in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Beis, in Even HaEzer. The Rambam writes, I'll just read a few words inside and then we'll paraphrase the rest. Kol mishpatos b'cheskas kisheros umuter lisa mehen lechatchila. This is not talking about Jewish determination per se, but deciding whether there may be some restriction on a person's eligibility to marriage. Either a person may be prohibited to marry a Kohen. There are certain classes of individuals that a Kohen may not marry, a divorcee, a convert, or there may be some concern of mamzerus, so a person may have been born from a forbidden union that prohibits that progeny from marrying fully within the Jewish people. So the Gemara says, the Rambam codifies that kol mishpachas b'cheskes kasheros, all families are presumed to be kosher, presumed to be eligible to marry, unless we know otherwise. However, the Rambam says, again, quoting the Gemara, that if you see two families that are constantly fighting each other, constantly at loggerheads with each other, or you see a person who starts up with everyone that he runs into, he's arrogant, we're concerned that maybe he has some kind of soul, maybe he has some kind of status that would restrict his marriage. Because one of the hallmark signs of the Jewish people, we may know this from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, is that the Jewish people, the progeny of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, are Baishanim, Rachmanim, V'golnei Chasadim. They are meek, they're compassionate, they engage in kind acts. So if you see someone that doesn't fit the bill, you have to be concerned that maybe something's off. Maybe they don't really belong. So at first glance, we might think this is a nice theoretical idea that the Gemara tells us about that is codified in Shulchan Aruch. But there's actually a psak, a ruling given by one of the rabbinic courts in Israel just a couple months ago out of Haifa that went as follows. In Israel, there's a centralized system of rabbinic courts that deal primarily with matrimonial matters and personal status matters. And they publish their opinions, their rulings on a somewhat regular basis. It used to be that they would come out with a volume every year or two, and that was all on the internet. So there's a psak that came out of the Beis Din in Haifa just a few months ago that had the following storyline. There was a couple in divorce proceedings, and the husband accused the wife of infidelity. The Beis Din turned to the wife and said, "What do you have to say?" She said nothing. Then the husband produced evidence. He produced some recording of a television show where apparently this woman had boasted of the fact that she was involved in these affairs outside of marriage. The Beis Din confronted the woman with this clip, and the woman acknowledged that yes, she did say that and it was true. So the Beis Din writes that when they heard this, they were so shocked at the cavalier attitude that this woman had to her infidelity and the fact that she was even boastful about it in a public setting, that they said to themselves, something's off here, maybe this woman isn't really Jewish. Sure enough, they went back to the files and they looked at the marriage records of this woman's parents when they got married in Israel decades earlier. And they looked at all the documentation proving Jewishness, and they had some investigator look into it, and they determined that the document that had been provided as evidence of Jewishness of the mother was forged. On that basis, the woman thought she was coming to Beis Din for a get. So they ended up issuing a ruling that the woman and whatever siblings she had and her mother are not Jewish, not allowed to remarry again to a Jew in Israel, and they fined her 25,000 shekel for being involved in in this forgery, even though it was really her mother's forgery. Fine. So lest you think that these things don't happen, apparently there was such a psak just recently out of Haifa that somewhat reminds me of a story that Rabbi Yeshiva Zylberman has in one of his svarim. Yeshiva Zylberman is a prominent posek in Bnei Brak, a son-in-law of Rabbi Yashiv, Zechron Livracha. So he has a story that there was a Baal Tshuva, someone who was becoming more observant and was making tremendous strides in living a basically Shabbos Torah observant lifestyle with one problem. The problem was that this person was a chain smoker, and try what he couldn't stop smoking on Shabbos. And people who were involved in his hadracha and guiding him didn't know what to do, so somehow the question got to Rabbi Yashiv. So Rabbi Yashiv heard the story, and he said, look into his yichus. So they looked into his yichus, and they found out that this person who thought he was a Baal Tshuva was in fact not Jewish at all. His mother was not halachically Jewish. He thought that he was. So as soon as he went through a proper conversion process, the taiva to smoke on Shabbos disappeared right away. So that's the mark of a gadol to see through this kind of a situation. Okay. With this Rambam, this Gemara about Baishanim, Gomle Chasadim, that's not referring to determinations of Jewishness per se. It's really in the context of excluding a mamzer, someone who is not allowed to marry freely within the Jewish people. What about establishing Jewishness as such? Is a person believed to come and say, I'm Jewish? A person walks in off the street, we don't know him one way or another, never saw him before. He comes to shul, he says, Rabbi, I'm Jewish, give me an aliyah. Or Rabbi, I'm Jewish, please officiate on my wedding. The Gemara in Pesachim and Daf Gimel Beis has a story that there was once a non-Jew who would come to Yerushalayim every year to partake of the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach may only be consumed by a Jew. And this non-Jew was very boastful of the fact that he fooled everyone. He came to Yerushalayim every year Erev Pesach. He was able to consume from the Korban Pesach and no one asked any questions. So once he was talking to one of the Tanarim, Yehuda ben Bavel, or Yehuda ben Beseira, sorry, who was living in Bavel, outside of Israel, and he mentioned that he goes to Yerushalayim every year, he has to Korban Pesach, and no one said anything. So Yehuda ben Beseira says to him, but you know, you never ask for the choicest part, you never ask for the tail. If you ask for the tail of the animal, they never give it to you. So this guy says, okay, I'm going to get it this time. He goes to Yerushalayim the next year, at Pesach. He says, can I please have the tail? And the people there realize that something's off because no one eats the tail. The aliyah is nectar. The owners don't eat the tail. The people who bring the korban don't eat the tail. So they looked into it, they investigated, and they found out that he wasn't Jewish. And then they sent a message back to Yehuda ben Beseira, Atin Sivin, Parsasech, Mitzvah Yerushalayim, that you're out in Bavel, but your net is spread out over Yerushalayim. Your influence goes far beyond where you live. Okay. So there's actually a dispute between the Bali Tosfos, dispute between different versions of Tosfos, whether this Gemara serves as a proof that a person is believed to say that he's Jewish. Because what happened? The guy went to Yerushalayim. Every year they give the Korban Pesach. They didn't ask any questions, and it wasn't until Yehuda ben Beseira came up with this trick that they're able to catch it. So at first glance, the Gemara seems to indicate that if a person comes and says that he's Jewish, we believe him. Says Tosfos, source number 2, not necessarily. Tosfos says, the end of the first line, Deshani hacha derov Yisrael hayu. If a person comes in a vacuum and he says, I'm Jewish, maybe you don't believe him. But this person was coming at a time and a place that the vast majority of people in that area were Jewish. Either the overwhelming majority of people that come to bring the Korban Pesach are Jewish, or the overwhelming majority of people in Yerushalayim are Jewish. Whatever that overwhelming majority is, this person was a part of that overwhelming majority. And you have the right to assume, absent any contrary information, that a person is from the rove, a person is from that majority. But maybe, if someone comes forward in Linden, so the majority of residents of Linden, I presume, are not Jewish, so you don't have the right to assume that they're Jewish absent any evidence. Tosfos says, even though you don't have a proof in this Gemara, maybe you have a proof from another Gemara. The Gemara in Yevamos, Memvav, Medbeis, Memzayim, and Aleph, those are the Gemaras that talk about conversion. So the Gemara there distinguishes between a person who comes and says, Niskayarti bein l'bein atzmi. A person comes and says, I converted, I don't have any evidence, but believe me that I converted. The Gemara says as follows, this is a summary of the bottom line, that if we presume the person, if we know the person to have been non-Jewish, and then one day he walks in and says, I converted. So if the starting assumption is that the guy wasn't Jewish, and he comes forward one day and says, no, I converted, then he's not believed without any evidence, because the presumption, the starting point, the chazakah, was that he wasn't Jewish. If a person, however, we don't know one way or another, we have no reason to believe he is, he isn't, never been discussed, never met him before, he comes in off the street, so then a person may be believed to say that he is Jewish, to say that he converted. Why is he believed to say that he converted? The person says, I was non-Jewish yesterday, I converted this morning, believe me that I converted. So that's what Tosfos explains in source number 4, Tosfos in Yevamos, that a person has something called a migo. A migo means, believe me when I claim A, because I could have claimed B, and you definitely would have believed me with claim B. So over here, Tosfos says, you see from that Gemara, if a person walks in off the street, and we know that he's not Jewish, and he says, I converted, we don't believe him. If we have no knowledge one way or another, so had the person come and said, I'm Jewish, we might have believed him. We don't know, we don't have reason to believe that he's not Jewish. So even if he says, I converted, we believe him because migo, he could have said that he was Jewish from birth. The Tosfos in Psachim assumes that Gemara in Yevamos is an indication that if a person says, we don't know one way or another, when a person comes and says that I'm Jewish, we believe him. Tosfos in Yevamos, source 4, thinks that even the Gemara in Psachim may be a proof to this idea of believing someone off the street that he is Jewish. Because any time a person comes and says, I'm Jewish, absent any contrary information, we believe him, and that's the simple read of the Gemara in Psachim, the simple read of the story of Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira, without distinguishing between where the Rov is Jewish and where the Rov is not Jewish, or the majority is Jewish or is not Jewish. Fine. So Tosfos disagrees about how we source this, but both of these presentations of Tosfos say, bottom line, if a person comes forward and says, I'm Jewish, absent any contrary information, if we never met the guy before, we have no reason to believe he is or he isn't, we accept his representation that he is Jewish. The Ritva, one of the Rishonim, one of the early commentaries on the Gemara in Yevamos, has a different rationale for why we would accept someone as Jewish. The Ritva writes, in the underlined citation here in source 5, Kol Shaba v'Amar Yisrael ani, Oger ani Naaman. Anyone who comes off the street and says, I'm Jewish or I converted, he's believed. The Somchem alav l'chol davar, we rely on him for everything. The Milsa da'avida la'gluyehi, that the facts will emerge, the truth will come out. It's something that's going to be discovered. The lo mishaker, that a person is presumed not to lie if the information he's lying about is going to be readily made public at some point in the near future. A person has a self-respect that he's not going to be caught in a lie if we know that the truth is going to emerge. So anyone who comes and says, I'm Jewish, we believe him, because the truth's going to come out sooner or later. Okay, so we have Tosfos who says, without qualification, a person is believed to say that he's Jewish, absent contrary information. We have the Ritva who says it's because of the notion of Milsa Davida Lagluya, the truth is going to come out. There is a comment of Reb Chaim Volozhner. Chaim Volozhner, the great founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva, one of the leading authorities of Lithuanian Jewry 200 years ago. So if you look in source 8, this is the Chazon Ish, Yeridea Siman Kuf Nun Ches. He quotes the following tradition from Reb Chaim Volozhner. Chaim Volozhner writes this in his Shuvas, and the Chazon Ish is quoting it here. Chaim Volozhner said that when do we believe someone who comes forward and says that he's Jewish if he seems to be acting like a Jew? But, and why is that? Because the majority of people who present themselves as Jewish are Jewish. So if you see he's acting like a Jew, he presents himself as Jewish, so you have the right to assume that he's from the majority of people who act as Jewish. However, says Reb Chaim Volozhner, in Eino Makir Sfasa Yehudis, if this person doesn't speak Yiddish, Absha Omer Shehu Yisrael, even if he says he's Jewish, Eino Neman. How can you believe such a person? How can he be Jewish if he doesn't speak Yiddish? The Ein Kan Rov Havan L'Fanei B'Torah Yad Yisrael. You can't say he's from the majority of people who present themselves as Jewish. He doesn't speak Yiddish. A person has to play the part. Chesed writes. Chesed is writing in either Bnei Brak in the 40s or early 50s, or in Europe before that. Chesed writes that was true in Volozhin in the 1800s, but it's not true anymore because even in Bnei Brak in the 1950s, there were plenty of Jews who weren't speaking Yiddish. So what Reb Chaim Volozhner means is you have to look at the context. You have to look at the society. If you're in a society where all good Jews speak Yiddish, then if the fellow doesn't speak Yiddish, you assume he's not Jewish. If you're in a society where that's not true, there's no halacha Moshe Messina that you have to speak Yiddish. So Rav Elyashiv writes in one of his tubas, Rav Elyashiv Chelek Aleph Simon Kuf Lamed Beis, the same may be true with the Russians. Rav Elyashiv is responding to the overwhelming Russian emigration into Israel in the 1990s, where a lot of people we know were not Jewish, and a lot of people, even those who were Jewish, were having a tough time proving it. So the Chesed writes, the Rabbi Yosef writes, the fact that there are people coming from Russia who are not observant or knowledgeable of Jewish law doesn't in and of itself impugn their credibility to be Jewish. It could be we don't believe them for other reasons. But if you're taking Reb Chaim Volozhner's principle that if you don't speak Yiddish, you can't be Jewish, and apply that, well, if you're not observant, if you don't have Jewish tradition, you can't be Jewish. If you're looking at people coming from 70 years of communist rule, where most of the Jews were not observant, not keeping traditions, then in their society, keeping Jewish tradition was not an indication or necessary indication of Jewishness. So that in of itself, the fact that someone coming from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s to Israel wasn't observant, wasn't traditional, doesn't mean that we can't presume to be Jewish. It could be there are other issues that come into play, as we'll note in a few moments. One of the most important sources on this topic, which very much informs how we operate practically both in the state of Israel and here in the U.S., is a comment of the Ber Heitev, source number 7. Ber Heitev is one of the super commentaries on the bottom of Shulchan Aruch, which is a digest of the earlier authorities, the earlier Achronim. The Ber Heitev here quotes from the base Hillel, another of the commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, that if someone comes from a foreign land, be he man, woman, young, old, and they're coming to a new community, they have to bring proof that they are Jewish. Even if they conduct themselves as Jewish, even if they speak Yiddish, even if they know Jewish practices, they still need to bring a positive proof. And he writes, this is Takanas Medinas Lita. This is the Takana in Lithuania. This was the common practice in Lithuania, not to officiate at any wedding unless a person brings an active proof that he is Jewish, that he or she is Jewish. So this very much is the, we'll call, de facto practice of the state of Israel. If anyone wants to come to get married within the official system of Israel, within the Rabbanut, you have to bring positive proof that you're Jewish. And to an extent, outside of Israel also, if someone comes and presents themselves as Jewish from another country, we have no idea what their background is, typically we will ask for some kind of positive proof of Jewishness. Is that absolutely required as a matter of law? Not necessarily. Is that an appropriate or acceptable, reasonable public policy consideration? It seems that there's a tradition to that effect going back hundreds of years. some of the issues raised in the context of the Russian immigration and the necessity to prove Jewishness for all these people, both in America and in Israel, are that there's a nice summary of this in a sefer called Mishnah Sager, a contemporary sefer about the laws of Gerus, written by Rabbi Moshe Klein. So he points out, he just puts together some of the information, that first of all, when it comes to the Russian emigration to Israel in the 1990s, there's such a large number of non-Jews in that mix, somewhere in the 30-something% range at least, that it's hard to rely on a presumption that anyone coming from Russia in that context was Jewish. And beyond that, when you see some of the rationale of the earlier sources, that in principle we believe someone who presents as Jewish because we have no contrary information, that's true in a time, in a society, in a place where no one would have any real vested interest in presenting as Jewish. In a time and a place where anti-Semitism is rampant, where persecution is rampant, where there's really nothing to be gained by presenting as Jewish. So if a person in that kind of society comes and says that he's Jewish, there must be something to that. But where to the contrary, if someone wants to move to Israel and there are economic, societal, etc. benefits to presenting as Jewish, so then, on the contrary, it's because being Jewish is incentivized, and you have to have more of a degree of skepticism about the person presenting himself. And also the comment of the Ritva, that Milsa Lavi Dilubluye, the truth is going to come out, so often that's not the case. Someone's coming from the former Soviet Union, what's the likelihood of the truth coming out? The records aren't easily accessible, and the truth is not going to come out so easily. Typically speaking, when we're called upon to make such determinations of Jewishness for someone who, so to speak, comes off the street without a tradition of observance, without much in the way of positive evidence, so the kinds of things that we'll look at are going back. Was there someone in the family on the maternal line who had an Orthodox wedding? Is there someone who was buried in a cemetery under Orthodox auspices? We'll look at census records. If someone in the 1920s on the Lower East Side is speaking Yiddish as a first language, that's probably a good indication that they're Jewish. So it's a combination of factors, Jewish practices. They remember the grandmother lit candles and had a Seder, etc., etc. So the combination, there's no absolute formula, but Bezin will look at a variety of different areas to make such a determination. There's an interesting tshuva that Tzitz Eliezer of Waldenberg, one of the leading poskim of the last generation, Chelik Zayin Siman Mem, talks about adoption. What believability does an adoption agency have to represent that a child being given up for adoption is Jewish? So he was talking about a governmental agency. I think the case was about Morocco, actually, where the agency that was overseeing the adoption was a government agency. When it comes to government agencies, there's a certain notion of uman lomaru nase, that a professional is not going to compromise his professional reputation by misrepresenting information. So if it's a government agency, there's a presumption that the government agency answers to a higher authority of some sort, is not going to misrepresent information, and therefore if the government agency represents a child to be Jewish, there's a certain degree of believability that is afforded to that representation. In America, there are no government adoption agencies, and to the extent that adoption traditionally, things have changed, but traditionally adoptions were closed and it was almost impossible to find information. So the representation of an adoption agency that a child is Jewish without any paper trail is often not sufficient evidence. And in most of those situations, if a Jewish family were to adopt or adopted a child, even if the representation was that the child was Jewish without evidence, a conversion, just to be safe, would have been recommended. There was a fascinating case we dealt with a number of years ago in the Bezdin of a middle-aged woman who already had children in Shidduchim who were looking to get married themselves, who discovered at that late stage in life that she had been adopted. And she was unaware whether her birth mother was Jewish or not, and she was confronting the reality that maybe she wasn't halachically Jewish and maybe her children weren't, even though they were living in a frum community. So the easy fix would have been to do a conversion out of doubt, just convert the mother and the children to solve any problem just in case. Problem was that this woman was living in the Syrian community. The Syrian community does not accept conversion, which is, we won't talk about that, but that's reality. And moreover, one of the children, the daughter, was seriously dating a Kohen. So if she would have had to convert, then that shidduch would have been off. So in that particular case, there was someone involved, a family member who did some research, was able to determine somehow the location of birth, and they knew the birth date. So this guy called up the town clerk and kind of, without saying where he was coming from, asked how many people were born in that town on that day, and found out that there was only one birth in that town on that day. Someone was able to track down the purported birth mother, and then was able to arrange a DNA test with a relative of the birth mother to compare that to the person approaching the Beis Din, and there's a positive determination of a match that this was indeed the birth mother who was Jewish. So that was a happy ending. That kind of segues in to one of the title was 21st Century Challenges. One of the 21st century issues, late 20th century into the 21st century issue, when it comes to determinations of Jewishness, has to do with definitions of maternity, particularly as it relates to artificial reproductive technologies, where babies conceived with the genetic material of one mother and carried by another, who is the halachic mother. The reason this is relevant is if the halachic mother is not Jewish, let's say you have a non-Jewish Avdon or a non-Jewish gestational carrier, and the other one is Jewish, but the conversion may be necessary if the halakhically recognized mother is not the Jewish one. So one of the sources for this discussion actually emerges from last week's Sedra, Parshas Vayigash. Where did that look up? Here we go. Take a look at page 1, the third actual page of Marmakomos, which says Vayigash on the top. I was wondering if that was the reason that in my daughter's nursery class last week they read Are You My Mother as the book of the week. So what does this have to do with Parshas Vayigash? So in the list of the 70 members of Yaakov's family that goes to Mitzrayim, we have one of the children of Shimon who is referred to as Shaul ben Haknanis. Then remember what Rashi says? Yeah.
The son of Dina.
Right, the son of Dina and Shimon. That she's referred to, Dina was referred to as Canaanis because of her relationship with Shem and Chamor. So according to Rashi, this child, Shaul, was the product of Shimon and Dina. Shimon and Dina were brother and sister anyway you slice it. They had the same father, Yaakov Avinu. They had the same mother, Leah. And everyone agrees that even a Noachide is not allowed to marry their full sister. Half-sister maybe, if they don't share a mother. Definitely not a full sister. So how did that happen? Source, page number 3. This is from the Moshe Zakanim, one of the collections of Bali Tosfos. Pasuk Yud. He quotes Rashi. The Tema. Heyat nasa Shimon as achoso. How could that be? How could Shimon have married his sister? If they have the same mother, that union is prohibited even for Noachites. Says the Moshe Zakanim in the second answer, Yesh Lamar, She'ikir Heiraya and Sheldina, the Betan Rachel Haya. As we know, the famous Chazal, that originally Dina was conceived in Rachel, and there was a embryo transfer from Rachel to Leah. So what's he saying? That since, it sounds like, since Rachel was the genetic mother of Dina, then Rachel is the halachic mother of Dina, and therefore Dina was not the full sister of Shimon. So some quote the Rishonim that say, like the Moshe Zakenim, is a source for identifying the genetic mother as the halachic mother. Others say, what do you bring us raya from a Gadata? This is not a halachic context. You can't prove from midrashic context. Okay. In the other direction, the next page, this is the commentary of the Maral on Megillas Esther, the Orach Chadash. Maral comments, by Hiomenas Hadassah, that Mordechai was raising Hadassah. Ki ein la ava aim. She didn't have a father and mother. Uvamos avia ve'ima, and when her father and mother died. So what does that mean? Uvamos avia ve'ima. So there's a drasha. Uvamos avia, when the father became a father, namely right after conception. Ve'ima, ubesha shenaseis la ima, is besha shenol, the time that she gave birth. Top of the second column. Because during pregnancy, she's not yet the mother. The mother is defined at the time that the baby is born. So some say, you see from this tradition, that it is the birth mother, not the genetic mother, that is the halachic mother. One of the earliest sources on the topic is the next page. There's a fascinating work, I think from the 1920s, written by Rabbi Yekusiel Kemelhar. Our Abbezin of Gedaliah of Shores, Yeshiva University, is very fond of this source, where he discusses a doctors' convention in Chicago in 1911. Dr. Eddie Reifman has an article on this topic in Tradition many years ago. So they discuss the possibility of an embryo transplant, apparently. So in the context of determining who the halachic mother would be in that kind of a situation, he quotes a source having to do with the laws of Orla, a fruit in the first 3 years, one is not permitted to eat. Let's say you have a grafting between a fruit that, a tree that already produced fruits at more than 3 years, and a younger tree. So he writes, the Gemara says in Sota, that in that case, the younger tree is batel, is nullified to the older tree. He thinks maybe that's a right, maybe that's a proof that the mother holding the uterus is the halachic mother, not the source of the uterus. Okay, bottom line, this is a major subject of dispute among contemporary rabbinic authorities. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, Zichron Levracha, was of the opinion, and the Rav Gedaliah of Schwartz, Yeshiva University, is of this opinion, that the gestational mother, the carrier is the halachic mother. Many others hold that it's the genetic mother. That's the position of Rav Ovadia Yosef, Zichron Levracha. That's the position, some dispute as to what Rabbi actually held in the end, but that may have been his position in the end. L'havdil the time l'chaim, that's Rabbi Willick's position, or Rav Asher Weiss seems to go in that direction. Bottom line, this is a major unresolved dispute among rabbinic authorities. As a practical matter, the practice of Batei Din of rabbinic courts, both in America and in Israel, is that if either partner is not Jewish, then we recommend a conversion of the child to solve any potential problem. And as we are running out of time, let me move to the last subtopic that I want to briefly address. And this is really cutting edge because the literature of this just came out in the last year or two. I forgot to bring with me a book on this topic that was recently published by Rabbi Zev Litka, up-and-coming scholar in Israel. The question is whether mitochondrial DNA can be used to assist in improving Jewishness. What does that mean? So there's a Dr. Skaricki in Israel who's done a lot of research on this topic, and he discovered, but has been working on the research, that there are certain what's called haplotypes, certain codes, certain sequences in DNA, in mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is only from the maternal line. So there's certain sequences that exist in very high proportion among certain Jews, among Ashkenazi Jews, and in very small proportions among the general population. So for example, in some of the literature, you have a haplotype that, just to round off the numbers, let's say will appear in 50 out of 1,500 Jews, but only in 7 out of 51,000 non-Jews. So you have this code, the sequence, that appears in 50 out of 1,500 Jews, but 7 out of 51,000 non-Jews. So on the one hand, that sounds like a pretty impressive statistic. That sounds like pretty likely if someone has this haplotype that they're Jewish. But if you look in the broader perspective, the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds times more non-Jews than Jews in the world would indicate that even the 7 out of 51,000 non-Jews that have this haplotype are a larger number than the number of Jews that have the haplotype. So how does this all fit into a halachic analysis? Well, one of the questions that was posed, just to briefly point out where this literature is Rabbi Zedlicker wrote a book on the topic. He has a couple articles submitted by the chief rabbi, Rabbi David Lau, and Rabbi Dr. Steinberg, one of the leading experts in the field of medical halacha. Rav Asher Weiss wrote a tshuva on this topic that was presented at one of the rabbinic conferences of the Dayanim in the court system in Israel that was recently printed in a volume called, I think, Orach Mishpat. One of the questions out in Rabbi Bleich is working on this. I think it'll appear in the next or one of the upcoming issues of Tradition, for those of you who subscribe. So one of the questions where this came up, the question that Rav Asher Weiss was asked was, there is someone in Australia who had a child who was intermarried, and the child couldn't care less that he was intermarried, but his family cared. And somehow someone had a conversation with this non-Jewish wife of this kid, and on her own, she said she remembers that maybe there's some Jewish blood in the family, and someone said something about being Jewish. So they submitted to this DNA test, mitochondrial DNA, and it came up with that haplotype that is common to, or more common in Ashkenazi Jews. So the question was, the family would be very happy to know that this girl is Jewish, even though she couldn't care less. So to me, that seems like a lower stakes issue. We're not, no one's coming to the Beis and asking to get married on that basis, but be that as it may. The bigger question is, how could this be used by, but they didn't, if at all. I mean, this Rabbi Lick is trying to push that, let's say you have a case that could go either way. You have a little bit of evidence that someone's Jewish, you don't have sufficient evidence, can this push you over the top? Part of the issue here is, how do you deal with these kinds of percentages? You can look at the statistics more than one way. So if you're looking at the overall probability, so in a vacuum, the overall probability may tell you he's more likely not Jewish. But if you have other evidence indicating that he's Jewish, then maybe that can shift the analysis. So one of the halachic constructs that is discussed in this context, that Rav Asher Weiss raises in his question, is the notion of a siman mufak, a sign that is a very clear sign. So we have this in the context of Hashavas Haveda, the Gemara Bava Metzia, that if a person finds a lost object, they have to identify the owner. So there's certain kinds of simanim, certain kinds of identifying factors that would indicate it must be this is the owner, because no one else has anything like it. It's totally unique. So in the extreme, one of the formulations that some of the Rishonim have, or Bnei Yerucham, is that something that doesn't exist in duplication at all. So in the context, it also comes up in the context of a woman whose husband disappears. She wants to get remarried, but there's no credible evidence that the husband dies. They find a dead body. It may be the husband, but there isn't absolute proof that it's the husband. Then they find that the dead husband had a certain birthmark that may identify him. So if it's the kind of thing that 1% of the population has, that's not such a strong identification. But if he's the only person in the world with that kind of a birthmark, so then that's what's called the siman mufak. That's clear that this is the husband, even if we don't have any testimony asserting that that's the case. So when it comes to the more traditional DNA discussion, is relying on DNA evidence to identify a person as whoever that person is. Let's say in the World Trade Center tragedies, part of the work that the Beis Din did was to assist in identifying, in a halakhically acceptable fashion, people who had been killed so that their wives could remarry. But DNA evidence was a big part of that equation, even if there wasn't the body that presented itself, but there was some DNA evidence. So many poskim assume, I would say at this point, the overwhelming consensus in the literature among contemporary authorities is that for the purpose of Eidus Isha, for the purpose of identifying someone as dead to allow a spouse to remarry, so then DNA evidence where there's a 1 in 10 billion chance that this isn't the person that we think it is, so that's a super semimorphic. That's a sign that's incontrovertible evidence that this person is the person that we think he is. But here we're talking about something totally different. We're talking about statistics, haplotypes, that a certain percentage of the population is presents among Ashkenazi Jews, a lesser percentage, a small percentage of the general population. So it's harder to argue that is necessarily a siman mufak. So this is a ongoing issue that really has just begun to be discussed among rabbinic authorities in the last couple of years, and I imagine that more as the science and the technology progresses, there'll probably be more to say, and it could be even at the moment there's no credible rabbinic authority who is taking on his authority that you can rely on this kind of mitochondrial DNA evidence to prove Jewishness in a vacuum. But as the technology develops, it's very conceivable that down the road there may be an option or possibilities that this could definitely be thrown into the mix to assist with such determinations. So bottom line, we've discussed some of the issues that come up on a regular basis at the best and some of the things that we confront in trying to assist people in determining Jewishness. Oftentimes we are successful. Sometimes we have cases where people just don't have the evidence to prove Jewishness, and in a vacuum we're not able to help. In that case, the route may be doing a conversion process just to make sure that their status is assured. But we try to act with the utmost sensitivity when people come with these kinds of questions to treat everything in a confidential and sensitive manner to help to the extent that we can help. And I guess it's important for the community to be aware of some of the things that do go on, as it's a service provided to the community and things that people sometimes may need to avail themselves of. It's a pleasure to join with you this evening.
I have two questions, but the one issue you didn't mention with respect to the adoption is the question of a mamzerim. Does that make a difference if a child is born of a woman who had an adulterous relationship? Does the child become converted, or what is the child?
If we know someone to actually be a mamzer, then that's a tough situation. It's very hard to have the level of, in a situation of adoption, if we know nothing.
If you know nothing, you assume that?
So then those are issues that need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. The second question had to do with Israel with regard to the Russians that are there. I know that Rabbi Riskin had a sensitivity to this issue, and I think was requesting that the chief rabbinate be a little bit more lenient with the determination of Jewishness. But do you know at this point what the status is of their being able to determine the Jewishness of the Russians that are seeking those benefits?
I think at this point, those determinations have largely been made, and there's a certain percentage of the population that can't prove Jewishness. There are organizations that do assist. There's an organization called Shorashim that does a lot of work with the Russian population. They have people all around the former Soviet Union who can access archives and records. So there are organizations that assist in determinations of Jewishness. But bottom line, there are still a significant number of people from that population that are certifiably not Jewish. And that's the issue that Israel has to deal with.
Thank you.
A question based on something that is not so dense as the presentation, which I enjoyed very much. What is the status of cooperation between the Rabbanut and the Beth Dins here in the United States?
So, over the summer, Rabbi David Lau took over the TIC, the portfolio of the Batei Din, We have a phenomenal relationship with him. We just had him come a couple months ago as our guest for a 2-day conference of Dayanim, the Bate Din dealing both with Geirus and with Gittin. We have an ongoing relationship with his office. They just contacted me today about something. I'm in contact with them probably on a weekly basis, if not more frequently. And we've developed very positive relationships in both directions where we work together to try to help the communities that we deal with.
I've been reading in some of the Jewish magazines lots of the so-called conversos from 500 years ago when Spain kicked them all out. There are places like that in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Monte, Portugal. They're coming out. Are they Jewish or are they Catholic, those people?
So it's very difficult to make positive determinations of Jewishness for these people who have been, let's say, non-practicing for 500 years. So there's definitely a orientation. If someone comes and presents themselves as B'nai Anusim, and they're interested in living an observant lifestyle to facilitate a proper conversion, just to shore up their status, we wouldn't necessarily have the same orientation that we'd have to someone off the street to try to discourage them. But at the same time, it's impossible to make, typically speaking, impossible to make absolute determinations. We had someone in our office about a year ago. Fascinating story with even some documents going back 150 years to one of the Latin American countries with a leather Megillah and a piece of Ksuba, which looked pretty frum, but there was no way of connecting this person to that shard of Ksuba from 100 years ago. So in practice, it's very difficult to make any positive determinations of Jewishness for those people. But one of the discussions that Rabbi Litka has in this book about his mitochondrial DNA is maybe these kinds of situations that DNA test could impact or help the picture. That remains to be determined.
We've had in the past individuals, random people, come off the street and start want to join our community because they say that they're Jewish.
And they like the Chinese food.
And and I mean, based on the halacha, it sounds like, well, they say they're Jewish. They could have used the migo. What are you supposed to do? And so then when you say you have to bring some positive evidence, or maybe they don't have to necessarily need to bring positive evidence, but sometimes when you start talking to them through the conversation, it sounds like it sounds pretty fishy.
Right.
And then you feel like, well, maybe this person is just looking for Kiddush on Shabbos, or they're just looking for someone to take them in and use the resources of the shul, but they're not actually Jewish. So how do you deal with at that point? How do you?
Right. So as a practical matter, that falls within at least the takana slit. That we don't believe someone off the street, even if you can make a viable halachic argument that in principle you should. And especially where, as you point out, there are other considerations why there may be motivations to want to be Jewish. So the in principle ikar adin fallback that we believe everyone is somewhat compromised. So as a practical matter, we don't believe someone coming off the street, and we would require some more evidence. Again, if someone comes off the street and wants to come to shul, you wouldn't throw them out of the shul. But if they want you to be without a kedushin for them, you have to do more research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.